Hello everyone, and welcome back to Boss Economic World, the show that cuts through the noise, debunks the spin, and tells you what's really going on with your money and your world. Alright, let's talk about the United Kingdom. It's October 2025. The leaves are turning brown, the days are getting shorter, and a deep, familiar gloom is descending upon Westminster. No, I'm not just talking about the weather. I'm talking about the British economy. Our newest Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, is staring down the barrel of a fiscal cannon. The Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, think of them as the nation's brutally honest accountants, is about to drop a bombshell. They're getting ready to tell her that the UK's economic engine is sputtering far worse than anyone thought, and it's going to punch a whopping £35 billion hole in her budget. Now, for those of you at home, what does a £35 billion hole mean? It means the government's credit card is maxed out, and the bill has just arrived. It means that promises of new hospitals and shiny schools might turn into, well, slightly less shiny hospitals and maybe just a fresh coat of paint for the schools. And it almost certainly means that Rachel Reeves, who famously swore she wouldn't come back asking for more money after last year's tax hikes, is about to break that very promise. More taxes are coming, folks. Brace yourselves. Faced with this political nightmare just over a year into her tenure, the Chancellor needs a story. A simple, powerful explanation for why things are so tough. A villain for the public to boo at. And it seems she's found the perfect one. The ghost of crises past, Brexit. Yes, that's the plan. The narrative being spun out of number 11, Downing Street is this: don't look at us. The reason our economy is in the doldrums, the reason your living standards are stagnant, and the reason we have to raise your taxes again is because of that messy divorce from the European Union back in 2016, and the decade of Tory austerity that came before it. It's a politically savvy move. It's an explanation voters understand. It's also a direct shot at the resurgent Nigel Farage and his Reform UK party, who are nipping at Labour's heels by, you guessed it, talking about the supposed benefits of Brexit. It's a bold strategy, to finally confront the B-word head-on after years of Prime Minister Keir Starmer treating it like Lord Voldemort. But here at Boss Economic World, we don't just report the political strategy. We ask the big question: is it true? Is Brexit the real culprit behind Britain's economic malaise? Or is it just a convenient scapegoat for a much deeper, much older, and much more complicated problem? Well, grab your tea, settle in, because we're about to put the British economy on the therapist's couch, dig into its long and troubled history, and restore the full picture. First, let's understand the core of the problem. It's not just about growth. The real disease crippling the UK and many other Western economies is a chronic case of low productivity. Now, productivity sounds like a boring, jargony word, but I promise you it's the most important economic concept you'll ever need to understand. Imagine you own a coffee shop. In year one, your barista, let's call him Bob, can make 10 cappuccinos an hour. That's his productivity. In year two, you buy a fancy new espresso machine. Now, Bob can make 20 cappuccinos an hour. His productivity has doubled. Because Bob is twice as productive, you can now afford to pay him more without raising the price of a cappuccino. You're making more money, he's making more money, and your customers are getting their coffee faster. Everybody wins. That, in a nutshell, is how an economy grows and how living standards rise. It's not about working harder, it's about working smarter and more efficiently. Now, here's the scary part. For decades, before 2008, UK productivity grew at a healthy clip, around 2 to 2.5% per year. But since then? It's flatlined. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, points to this chart and says the UK's productivity is now a staggering 25% lower than it would have been if we'd stayed on that pre-2008 trend. That is a catastrophic loss of potential wealth. It's the difference, as Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey pointed out, between our national debt being a manageable 82% of our economy versus the scary 96% it is today. It's the reason why real wages have barely budged in 15 years. So, the crime is clear: the murder of British productivity growth. And according to the government's new narrative, the prime suspect is Brexit, which happened in 2016. Case closed, right? Wrong. This is where the official story starts to fall apart. Any good detective knows the first thing you check is the timeline. And the timeline here is damning for the prosecution's case. Remember that 25% productivity gap? Well, let's thank the nerds at the Office for National Statistics. Back in October 2016, just a few months after the referendum, they published a little-noticed report. It showed that by the end of 2015, that is, before a single vote had been cast on Brexit, the productivity shortfall was already 18%. Let me repeat that. Nearly 3/4 of the productivity damage was already done before Brexit happened. Blaming Brexit for the entire 25% productivity gap is like arriving at a murder scene in the evening and blaming the postman who delivered a package that morning, while ignoring the fact that the coroner's report says the victim died the night before. So, if it wasn't Brexit that started this fire, what did? The real year zero for Britain's economic problems wasn't 2016. It was 2008. The global financial crisis. That crisis wasn't just a blip. It was a heart attack for the global financial system. It did a few things that we are still living with today. 1. Zombie companies, it choked off credit. Banks, terrified of another collapse, stopped lending to all but the safest companies. This meant innovative, high-growth startups were starved of cash, while unproductive, barely surviving zombie companies were kept on life support with cheap debt, clogging up the arteries of the economy. 2. Investment black hole, it made everyone, governments, corporations, and individuals, terrified of risk. Companies stopped investing in those fancy new espresso machines, in new technology, in research and development, and in training their staff. This is the absolute killer of productivity growth. 3. Global slowdown, this wasn't just a UK problem. As Jonathan Portes, an economist at King's College London, points out, the productivity slump has clearly not just been in the UK. Europe has been better, but not much. Germany, France, Italy, they all caught the same economic disease after 2008. The US has done a bit better, largely thanks to its tech boom, but even there, productivity growth has been slower than in the pre-crisis era. So, when Rachel Reeves points the finger at the last 14 years of conservative government, she's not entirely wrong. But she's starting the clock too late. The deep-seated rot began under the last Labour government, not because of their policies, but because the entire global economic model broke on their watch in 2008. Okay, so the 2008 crisis was the original sin. But what about the other factors? Brexit isn't totally innocent here. Let's line up all the suspects and see how much of the blame they really deserve. Suspect number 1, austerity. After the 2008 crisis, the Conservative-led coalition government from 2010 embarked on a massive program of austerity, slashing public spending to try and reduce the national debt. Reeves is right to point this out. Cutting public investment in infrastructure, education, and science definitely harms long-term productivity. But how much? The Bank of England's own analysis, hidden away for years and only released in 2024, estimates that all those Tory cuts and tax rises pulled down the level of GDP by a little over 2%. It's a real number, and it hurt. But compared to the 25% productivity hole, it's a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. Suspect number 2, Brexit. Now for the main event. What was the actual impact of Brexit? Well, the OBR and the Bank of England, the two most credible referees in this game, have run the numbers. They estimate that leaving the EU's single market and customs union will permanently reduce the UK's long-run potential GDP by somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. This happens through a few channels. Trade friction, it's now more expensive and bureaucratic to trade with our closest neighbors. More paperwork, more checks, more delays. That's sand in the gears of commerce. Investment chill, the uncertainty surrounding Brexit, and the reality of being outside the world's largest single market, has made some foreign companies think twice about building their next factory in the UK. Labor market shock, an end-to-free movement made it harder to fill jobs, from farm laborers to NHS doctors, which has contributed to labor shortages and inflation. So, let's be crystal clear, Brexit has hurt the UK economy. It was an act of economic self-harm. Rob Wood at Pantheon Macroeconomics says it will continue to drag on growth for the foreseeable future. It made a difficult situation worse. But add the 4% from Brexit to the 2% from austerity, and you get a 6% hit. That still leaves a massive, 19-point chunk of our 25% productivity problem completely unexplained by the government's chosen narrative. Suspect number 3, the real masterminds, chronic underinvestment and bad policy. So what explains the rest? This is the uncomfortable truth that no politician wants to talk about, because it doesn't have a simple villain. The blame lies with decades of collective failure by governments of all colors. As economist Simon French at Panmure Liberum points out, it's a whole cocktail of problems: dysfunctional government policies on energy, a broken housing market, short-sighted pension rules, and tangled post-2008 financial services regulation. Think about it. If your energy costs are among the highest in Europe because of poor long-term planning, your factories can't compete. If your housing market is so broken that a young engineer can't afford to move to Cambridge or Oxford where the high-tech jobs are, you stifle innovation. If your pension funds are discouraged from investing in high-growth British startups and instead just buy safe government bonds, you starve your most dynamic companies of capital. This is the big one. Professor Portes estimates that Brexit is responsible for about a fifth of the total productivity decline. The vast majority, he says, was caused by a general failure to innovate, modernize, and invest. For decades, the UK has been trying to run a 21st-century economy on 20th-century infrastructure, with an underskilled workforce and a financial system that too often prefers to fund property speculation over genuine enterprise. It's like blaming your car's terrible performance on the slightly dodgy petrol you put in yesterday, while ignoring the fact that the engine hasn't had an oil change since 2008, the tires are bald, and the chassis is rusting through. So, let's bring it all back to Rachel Reeves and her £35 billion problem. What we are witnessing is a classic case of political expediency versus economic reality. Blaming Brexit is a smart, short-term political tactic. It gives Labour a simple story for a complex problem, allows them to deflect blame for the painful tax rises to come, and puts their main rival, Nigel Farage, on the defensive. There's even a split in Downing Street about it. Some aides think it's a masterstroke, while others are terrified of reopening the Brexit wars and alienating the very red wall voters they worked so hard to win back. But while it may be good politics, it is terrible economics. Because if you misdiagnose the illness, you can never find the right cure. The real story of the UK's economic decline is not a simple tale of one bad decision in 2016. It's a long, complex saga of a post-imperial nation struggling to find its place, hit by a global financial earthquake in 2008, and then failing to make the tough, long-term investments in skills, infrastructure, and technology needed to recover. Austerity made it worse. Brexit made it worse still. But they were symptoms and accelerants of the disease, not its root cause. The danger for Chancellor Reeves is that by leaning so heavily on the Brexit excuse, she avoids confronting these deeper, harder truths. It's easier to blame Nigel Farage than it is to admit that fixing Britain requires a decades-long national mission to reform the housing market, rewire the financial system to support innovation, and rebuild our crumbling public infrastructure. Reeves has talked a good game about this, pledging an extra £120 billion in capital spending. That's a start. But it's a drop in the ocean of what's truly needed. And if her primary explanation for the UK's woes is something that's already happened and can't be reversed, it risks creating a sense of fatalism. It's an excuse for failure, not a plan for success. So, as the budget approaches on November 26, watch closely. The headlines will be about the tax hikes and the political blame game. But the real, unspoken story is the one we've talked about today, a productivity puzzle that is 15 years in the making, and which no politician has yet had the courage, or the honesty, to truly solve. Blaming Brexit might get the government through a tough winter. But it won't keep Britain warm in the long run. And that, my friends, is the full picture. What do you think? Is this a clever political strategy or a dangerous economic delusion? Is Brexit the main villain, or just a convenient scapegoat for decades of failure? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode of Boss Economic World. I'm your host, Boss. Thanks for watching.